to address this, we need to have very deep changes in the agriculture sector quite quickly, and that in order to do this, most people would agree that we need finance to drive that. But the real question is, what kind of finance and how? And so the proposition of this particular session is that we need finance that is mainstreaming climate action. In other words, mainstream lending and mainstream investment, mainstream policy that influences financial flows needs to either require or provide incentives that include climate action. We're going to focus in this session on mitigation, but we recognize that both resilience and mitigation are important climate actions. So we have an exciting lineup for you. I'll just quickly run through the agenda. Let's see if I can get the agenda up. Let's see, it's quite slow. Am I not pointing this in the right direction? Okay. It's not coming up. Is it possible that this isn't? Isn't working? Yeah, I tried. I wonder if we could get a replacement. I'm not sure this is working. There we go. Okay. So, our agenda for the morning, we're going to start with 5 speakers, 5 fantastic speakers, actually. Angela Falconer from the Climate Policy Initiative will give us the broad overview of the context, the problem, and some possible solutions. Gabriela Weber de Morais is going to speak from Finance in Motion, giving us some examples of their work. Then Mark Ellis-Jones from F3 Life is also going to give us some examples of climate-smart lending. Alex Mulisa from Rwanda is going to talk about FONERWA, which is Rwanda's Green Climate Fund. And we'll finish with Ash Sharma from the Nama facility. We'll then move into, we'll have a few clarifying questions, and then we'll move into a panel where we'll discuss what the vision for finance should be in the sector, with comments from Lizzie Teague from Root Capital and Juan Chang from the Green Climate Fund. So thank you, everybody, and we'll begin. Angela? Oh, sorry. Fraser,
Which one is forward? This one? Okay, great. Thank you. Well, thank you very much, Leni, and to CCAFs for co-organising this event and getting such a wonderful panel together. Without further ado, let me hopefully move on to the next slide. Can you manually move on to the next slide for me, or? You can just say next slide if you want to move it manually. Okay, here we are. Great, thank you. So I'd like to give you a little bit of a context on how much climate finance is flowing at the moment to mitigation in the agriculture sector. These are our new numbers from Climate Policy Initiative on global flows of climate finance in 2015-16. Annual flows amounted to $410 billion of new investment to address climate change in mitigation and adaptation. It's worth noting that 93% of the finance that we have tracked here is going to mitigation, only 5% to adaptation. This is a function of the data that we have available, but also to some extent a reflection of the reality. 2/3 of what we track is private finance, 1/3 public. And 80% is domestic, which means that it's finance raised and spent in the same country, which really underlines the importance of domestic enabling policy, environments, and ecosystem for enabling private investments, which I think will be a theme that we will talk about today. Moving to the next slide, I mentioned that 93% of the finance that we track is on mitigation, but a very small amount is going to the land use sectors and indeed to agriculture. So we don't have any good data available on private finance going towards the agricultural sector. This view that you see here is just on the public side. Public mitigation finance going to agriculture amounted to $700 million in 2015, 0.7 billion. That's only half a percentage of public mitigation finance that's going to agriculture at the moment. On the adaptation side, if we move to the next slide, it's a little bit more positive. We have $3.2 billion in 2015 of public finance going to agriculture and to adaptation, however. Moving to the next slide again. So we see that there's only about $500 million of finance going to agriculture and to mitigation in the agricultural sector. The opportunity, though, has been estimated to be huge. Alpha, beta figures that are presented here, and sorry, are too small for you to see here, estimate that needs of investment per year are about $320 billion in food and agriculture. These are opportunities that they have estimated related to implementation of the Sustainable Development Goals. So the question is, how are we going to seize this opportunity, and why do we have so little public finance going towards mitigation in the agricultural sector at the moment? If we can move to the next slide, please. Climate Policy Initiative a few years ago started a new public-private initiative called the Global Innovation Lab for Climate Finance. This is a public-private initiative that aims to identify, develop and launch new sustainable finance instruments and mechanisms to drive billions through to mitigation and adaptation. It's already managed to raise $1 billion for 25 new innovative financing mechanisms in the first 2 years. And we do have a couple of instruments that focus on agriculture. We've been working with F3 Life, Mark, on a Climatesmart lending platform, which you'll hear more from him about. We also have an instrument in our Brazil lab, which is a cattle ranching, Climatesmart cattle ranching mechanism, similar to what Mark is developing in terms of conditional finance on sustainable ranching practices. We'll stay on this slide just for a second. So this initiative is funded by the UK, US, German, Dutch governments, as well as several philanthropic institutions. And it really draws on the network of lab members that are involved from different development finance institutions, donors, developing countries. FONERWA is part of the lab as well. They support the instruments that are selected to go through the lab and help us to develop really solid business cases that are investable by the end of the process. Just to give you one example of an instrument, if you can move to the next slide, please. From our Brazil lab, this focuses on mitigation in the agricultural sector in relation to energy use by agricultural cooperatives, and it aims to promote distributed energy generation. It does that in two ways, by having pay-for-use contracts, which remove the high upfront costs of installing energy for the agricultural cooperatives. and also a two-part payment for performance structure, which means that payments are fixed and variable depending on the energy performance. This reduces the risk for the agricultural cooperatives. So this is now going into pilot phase in the south of Brazil for 9 agricultural cooperatives with 23 megawatts of wind in Rio Grande do Sul, and will be 62 million US dollars investment, and will find high energy savings on energy bills for the agricultural cooperatives. So that's just to give you one example from our innovation lab of where we are trying to help to sort of scale up innovative financing mechanisms and finance that's going to agriculture and mitigation. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much. Yeah. Thank you, Angela. And now we'll go to Gabriela Weber de Morais.
So thank you, Lini. Yes, I'm Gabriela, as Lini introduced, and I'm representing here Finance in Motion. We are Impact Asset Management, Impact Investor Asset Management, and I'm going to be talking about one of the funds that we advised, which is the Eco Business Fund, and I'm going to explain to you a bit how we are crafting our approach to invest in sustainable cattle farming. Yes. So, as you know, probably here the audience is very well versed that traditional livestock production has several impacts on the environment, and at the same time it has a very important presence in the economy. So it provides jobs to more than 1 billion people, and it's important in Latin America, where the Eco Business Fund is investing. It's important because it's almost half of the agriculture GDP in Latin America. And when we are talking here, we are talking about cattle farming within the livestock sector, which is the one which has the major impact on environment. So what's the Eco Business Fund? The Eco Business Fund was founded in 2014, actually exactly 3 years ago. And the concept was developed by the German Development Bank, KfW, and together with Conservation International and also Finance in Motion. The aim of the fund was precisely to promote business that contribute to biodiversity conservation. So we wanted to increase the role of the private sector in biodiversity conservation. And for doing so, we selected 4 sectors to invest, which are agriculture, forestry, tourism, and fisheries. And the idea is basically, it has expanded. So biodiversity is still very important, but it goes beyond biodiversity only, also to increase sustainable practices in this sector and also climate change mitigation and adaptation. As I said, the region so far is Latin America. We have been focused very much on biodiversity-rich countries. And how we do this? We do through 2 ways. One is direct investments, which we haven't yet started with the Eco Business Fund, but also through indirect investments. So we select partner institutions, financial institutions in this region, which share the same values with us, and we invest through them. So we reach the final sub-borrowers through the financial institutions. Thus far, we do this in 2 ways. One is through investing in business that already have sustainability certifications, so Rainforest Alliance, Global Gap, and so forth. And the other way is to establish a green list in which we select what kind of activities, what kind of investments we want to make. So far, we have been investing more in agriculture. That's the main part of the accounts for most of the portfolio so far. And we are starting to craft our approach to invest in livestock production. And since the deforestation and biodiversity in general is very important to the fund, in addition to the regular procedures that we have, what we demand the financial institutions to have, we have additional requirements for investing in livestock production. So these requirements I'm going to talk a bit about, but it's in the next slide. And this is the approach. So before we start investing in cattle farming with a financial institution, the first thing we want to establish is the safeguards. So first of all, we are not investing in any business that's going to be in a protected area, IUCN category 1 to 3, with some restrictions in IUCN category 4 to 6. And we also set a cutoff date, so there cannot be any deforestation by the client after 2005. Also here, the idea is, and it's precisely where we are now, we are testing providers of satellite images so that we can collect this data. Once we have collected this data, we are testing this currently in Nicaragua. So we have eight clients where we are testing. And then we are moving to the next steps. The next step would be to categorize the clients. And this categorization involves seeing what they are doing and if it matches the activities that we have in the green list. What kind of activities we are selecting for livestock production? These are silvopastoral systems, improved nutrition, waste management, which is also important in terms of climate mitigation, and so forth. And then after selecting and seeing which clients want to improve their practice, so they are not contributing to deforestation and they are improving their practice, then we are going to have this third component, which is the monitoring of no deforestation compliance throughout the life cycle of the loan. So here's just one example of one satellite image that we are testing. This is the current stage. We have now this pilot going on in Nicaragua, and the next year probably is going to be our first investment, which are going to be in Panama. This is just one example of kind of data we are looking at the clients when we are doing the categorization. And finally, we have here also what we understand to be a sustainable livestock production and how we want to contribute. So it's not that the clients, they are going to have all these practices in one farm, but actually that we want to support them with this transition. So we are making sure we are not contributing to the deforestation, and we want to enhance their practice in sustainable cattle farming. I think that's it. Thank you.
So we'll take questions after all of the speakers. And next, I'd like to introduce Mark Ellis-Jones from F3 Life.
Good morning. My name is Mark Ellis-Jones, and I run a company called F3 Life. And in partnership with the Global Innovation Lab for Climate Finance at CPI, Financial Access, a Dutch company which designs credit scoring tools for smallholder farmers, and IUCN, we are the Climatesmart lending platform, which aims to generate climate-smart lending deals. A very brief introduction to what F3 Life does. I think this audience will no doubt be very familiar with the challenges faced by smallholder agriculture around reduced yields associated with climate change and increased number of weather shocks resulting in crop failure. What's often overlooked is the impact that will have on the institutions lending to smallholder farmers, both by way of reduced smallholder bankability, a lowered ability of smallholder farmers to take loans, and secondly, increased credit default risk. And by way of anecdote, we speak to a lot of chief credit officers, chief executive officers at lending institutions in Africa, and we know that they're all considering, if haven't already, started pulling credit lines to smallholder farmers because of weather shock. That's obviously quite a concern in terms of food security in those regions. But the big question we have is, can we link the mitigation benefits of improved agriculture through increased carbon sequestration soils to climate-related financial risk. What is climate-smart lending? This is the F3 Life system. It consists of 5 key steps. The first is that when a farmer signs a loan agreement, they also sign a land management agreement, stipulating how they have to manage their land to increase resilience to climate change and increase sequestration of carbon to soils. The second step is that they have to implement the measures that are required under their loan agreement. I'll give you a sort of a clear example of what I mean by that on the next slide. They implement those measures as they repay their loan. And then our systems are used to verify that the farmer client is in compliance with those environmental management measures. The fourth step is that we translate verification of implementation into a score which is provided back to the lender for incorporation into their credit scorecard or credit scoring algorithm. And that leads to reduced credit default risk and increased smallholder bankability, or is designed to. This is an example of a climate-smart credit product designed for a particular agroecological context in Kenya, where, and as you look at this slide, bear in mind that loan amounts can change, interest rates can change, and the conservation requirements associated with the loan can change. But just by way of example, access to a $20 loan required completion of a training, access to a $40 loan required planting of 1 grass contour strip on the farmer's land to act as a barrier to soil erosion. To access an $80 loan, the farmer had to plant multiple grass strips on their land. And then in the subsequent loans, the farmer had to reinforce those grass contour strips with tree seedlings. And then to access the higher loans, that system needed to be sort of well established and then thriving. This is an adaptation benefit to the farmer in that it should result in increased income, both by way of holding nutrients on the farmland and reducing avoided costs associated with weather shock. There's also a carbon sequestration or mitigation benefit to this, and really under some sort of land practice management or land management approaches, you can target a sequestration potential of 8 tons of CO2 per hectare per year. The value proposition, or the question as to why a bank would employ this approach, is that it's designed to alongside increasing the farm yield for the farmer, reduce the credit default risk associated with lending to that farmer, and increase the debt service coverage ratio of the farming client, which basically means that because they're earning more, they can afford to take and repay more debt. Embedded in our approach is the idea of environmental interest rates. We acknowledge that the work done by farmers is a way of restoring natural capital. And when a farmer takes a loan, they manage financial capital, and they pay an interest on that, which is financial interest. What we've observed is that when natural capital is used to create a profit, it can be run down, and therefore restoration activity is needed to sort of keep the system or its productivity in check. And we style that as environmental interest, and we think it needs to be in balance with the financial interest. So the restoration or the maintenance of the natural capital needs to be in balance with what is taken out of the system. We're working towards sort of methodologies that will help us sort of precisely measure that interest rate or define that interest rate. But if there's anybody in the audience who has some expertise in that, we'd be very happy to talk to you. The climate-smart lending approach that F3 Life developed is being pushed now by the Climate-smart lending platform partners. And the Climate-smart lending platform aims to bring together the types of capital that are required to extend credit provision to smallholder farmers, together with tool providers such as F3 Life, but others as well who provide tools for climate-smart lending, such as insurance providers, and link those tools and that capital to local lenders who then on-loan agricultural credit to smallholder farmers on climate-smart terms. We're scaling up in 3 stages. We're currently developing projects in Ghana, Kenya, and Rwanda, and are aiming to grow the number of farmers participating in climate-smart credit schemes to 45,000 over the next 3 years. And that is the end of my presentation. Thank you very much for listening.
Next we'll have Alex Mulisa from FONERWA.
Good morning. As stated, my name is Alex Mulisa, and I work with the Fund for Environment and Climate Change, which is a national fund for Rwanda. And that's a map of Rwanda. One wonders why I put a map of my country there. I don't know why it's skipping. How do I go back? Yeah. Simple reason is the climate relevance, both adaptation and mitigation. Rwanda is a very small country, highly populated, and it has a hilly landscape, extensively hilly landscape. And because of that, we have extensive soil erosion. Patterns are changing for the onset of rain, and these days rain intensity has really gone up, and that bodes well for the soil erosion that we talked about. Now, the other thing on the human factor is the fact that over 80% of Rwandans depend on subsistence agriculture. I guess typical of most of the sub-Saharan Africa. And because of that, agro inputs are intensely used. And the second communication to the UNFCCC, studies indicated that over 80% of the greenhouse gases actually come from agriculture. So that is the direct relevance. The other issue is the fact that studies have indicated the role of climate change, the cost of climate change and the impact on the GDP itself. And the numbers are out there. Rwanda needs about $300 million every year to just address climate change. Yes, thanks. Now, based on what I've talked about, we came up with a green growth and climate resilience strategy, and it has 14 programs of action. And the programs of action are all outlined there, but 2 of them are within agriculture, and then there's one of them that is on forestry and agroforestry. Part of the reason is because we use as well intensely biomass as a source of energy, and that of course is linked with the soil erosion and is linked with the mitigation aspect in agriculture. Now, as a result of that, we came up with a fund for environment and climate change to be able to address all those issues that have been talking about. This is the design features, but what is important is when you look at what the fund intends to do for the future is how to crowd in private sector resources within the fund. So we have been successful in terms of mobilizing public sector. Up to now, we have been able to mobilize around 90 million, predominantly from bilaterals and multilaterals in terms of private investments. But the fund is designed in a way that private sector should increasingly become a key player in the climate space in Rwanda. Just as it is for most other development, that is the decision Rwanda has taken based on the fact that we want to become a middle-income country. And we are convinced that there is nowhere in the world where a country has emerged into a middle-income country without the significant role of the private sector. So likewise, the fund must also attract private investments. And that is where public sector resources come in to be able to de-risk the initial investments, particularly to crowd in private sector. And some things have been happening so far, as we will see. The fund has been in operation for the last 5 years. We have been able to support projects up to 32 projects. And this is just an example where you see the green labels. That is primarily most of the funding that has gone in agriculture to deal with sustainable land management. When you look at the private sector inputs, it has been predominantly in things to do with the construction sector, because the construction sector is growing significantly. It's in the energy sector, but most of the investments so far, close to around 70%, have been in sustainable land management, forestry, and afforestation projects. So this is how critical agriculture is, both from the adaptation standpoint as well as from the mitigation standpoint. A number of things have come. I talked of subsistence agriculture being predominant, and the fact that small-scale agriculture or smallholders are benefiting from public sector resources has not really translated into the kind of transformation we are looking for. So the strategy is to see how we can crowd in, we can bring on board private sector, and the smallholder, rather the smart lending platform is one of the mechanisms we are considering. Right now there is a proposal that we are looking at to understand some of the ways in which private sector can be brought on board to deal with smallholder farmers primarily in terms of investments, cooperatives, a movement that is coming up. The question is, how do we use the private sector resources, the public sector resources, to be able to bring in private resources? These are some of the challenges, but also present opportunities. We can see the funding streams. I talked of the predominant resources coming from private sector, rather from the public sector. But one of the things that is critical is how do we, again, understand the markets, use screening methods to be able to target private sector investments flowing into smallholder farmers. The other aspect we have to look at is the synergistic aspect. Predominantly, agriculture is adaptation-driven, intense floods, but the question is, how do we bring in to address adaptation with a view to even benefiting from the linkages, as cross-cutting as they talk about. And that will require the multi-sectoral consideration where forestry, agriculture have to work together to be able to realize the benefits. In Rwanda, even when you talk of energy itself, soil erosion causes siltation, and if watersheds are not protected, even as a benefit in terms of sustainable land management, we are losing on the ability to even generate energy that is so critical for manufacturing and transitioning. So there's a whole range of linkages in terms of the co-benefits that we can derive, even as we focus on agriculture by itself. I believe the first slide showed about the partnerships. We have Global Green Growth as partners in terms of supporting capacity development. We have DFID, of course, that has invested in the fund. We have KFW, a range of partners that have worked with us to be able to come this far. Thank you.
Our next speaker is Ash Sharma from the Nama facility.
Okay, thank you, and good morning, or good afternoon, everyone. My name is Ash Sharma, thank you. I represent a publicly funded climate fund, which manages 260 million euros worth of financing from the UK, Germany, Denmark, and the European Union. The NAMA facility is really aiming to be a vehicle for learning and disseminating best practices. So for this reason, we're very grateful to be here and to share some of our early lessons learned with all of you. If we move to the first slide, you can just see a good a map here which shows the kinds of projects that we're working with. I'm very pleased to say that in terms of our portfolio, we support 21 projects. Around 20% of our portfolio relates to agriculture and agribusiness, which includes, for example, a beef sector supply chain project in Brazil. It's a very interesting program, just started. A Thai rice NAMA, a Costa Rican coffee NAMA, and I believe you can sample some of the NAMA coffee at the German pavilion. So please do take advantage of that. Okay, so in terms of what we're hoping to achieve, our focus is really on transformation. And the objective here is to shift a sector in a country towards a more sustainable and irreversible low-carbon pathway. And this is something that should happen much faster than the business-as-usual scenario of technological development. Trying to achieve this level of transformational change with the level of grants that we provide, which is up to 20 million euros, which is not insignificant, but in terms of trying to make a dent in some of these sectors, does require a lot of leveraging. And the small graph you'll see there relates to the sorts of financial leveraging that we hope to achieve. We're looking at every euro that we provide leveraging 7 euros of both public and private financing. And actually, we would like to see more of the private financing. So we are in a situation where some of this money is being used to leverage more public funding. And of course, we want to move beyond that. We want to, as has been mentioned before, we want to crowd in private sector funding. We seek minimum concessionality, particularly in many of the middle-income countries that we work in. And you can see here from our next slide that there are a number of financial mechanisms that are being used in the programs that we work with. Finance is very much at the core of what we try to achieve, along with pipeline building and developing more bankable projects that can be funded and taken forward. So we've seen that many of the early programs that we worked with, they did focus very much on targeted investment grants, and we're trying to move away from that towards more leveraging. And you can see, for example, the Brazil project that we have in development is looking at a first loss guarantee program to work with ranchers, but also with other actors along the supply chain. And we can see there's a possibility of leveraging of up to 15 to 20 times for each euro that we put forward. I'll just make some comments. Apologies for the dense text there. Please don't read it all. But what we've learned in terms of the business models for the projects that we've supported really is that in order to have a convincing business case, i.e. to get funding from our instrument, the things that we found is that it's very important to have to make clear the economic and other motivations of each group. And this can be producers, suppliers, end users, and that's often not adequately covered in what we've seen. We have to describe the incentives that will change behavior, to go into some details around the capital and investment flows. I mean, some of these are very obvious things if you work in finance and are developing projects, but often these issues are not well addressed. One other issue I would mention here is the affordability. The funding that we provide is transitional, and the new technology that is being implemented has to be taken forward within the affordability of that target group, or a concept for sustainable financing of uptake after that should be well described. We often have business cases, for example, which are built on capital cost subsidies. These are rarely viable in our view. They also offer a very low leveraging opportunity. Where they are relevant, they should only be a very minor aspect of capex. They should avoid market distortions, and they should employ transparent selection criteria. We also have some concerns about straightforward demonstration projects. We've seen a lot of these. I think, again, one has to show and demonstrate how replicable and scalable these can really be going forward, particularly after the first projects have been implemented. How can these move forward in a real life financing condition? Just to sum up, really, in terms of financial sustainability, we see this as a critical aspect of what we look at. A lot of our early projects wanted investment grants, also short-term instruments that can be funded by a grant facility like ours, like interest rate subsidies. We believe that it's better to look in terms of sustainability at more permanent sources to redirect these financial flows going forward. So, for example, employing public sector budgets, taxes, guarantee instruments domestically, working with local institutions wherever possible, contributions from private households where appropriate, and industry. We've seen that in some of the projects, for example, in the beef sector. The funding concept needs to be temporary with a clear phase in and phase out. And while we focus on financing, it's important to understand that there are a lot of opportunities for policy reforms, regulatory changes, which can be funded through technical assistance, where again you have a very high level of leveraging for the funding that you're offering. I think a general comment I would make in conclusion is really the role of public financing in this really is around de-risking investments, building project pipelines, and we see ourselves really as a test bed for some of these more innovative financing instruments. So I'll stop there. I will, if you just indulge me one moment, say that on Monday we have a side event at which hopefully we will make a very interesting announcement for the future. So thank you very much. Please.
Thank you, Ash. So now we have a few minutes for clarifying questions, and may I ask that you state your name and affiliation? I'll take a round of 3 questions. Yeah, please. Go ahead.
Thank you. Charles Kaviswa from Uganda, and my question goes to Gabriela. I'm just wondering if the modern eco-business fund is applicable to the pastoral communities. The model you presented, is it applicable to the pastoral communities, the eco-business fund? Then I have one for Mark. From the chain presented, I did not see the linkage with the risky disaster risks which may affect the farmers. So do you have some linkages with the risk insurance or something like that? Because it is very important. Then lastly, to Nama, I'm wondering if it is micro focus or it is only macro, because what we've presented is big businesses.
Thanks. And may I just ask that people limit themselves to one question? Please go ahead.
My name is Kopetz. I'm from the World Bioenergy Association. I have one question to Gabriela. You spoke about cattle farming in Brazil. My question is, one main reason for greenhouse gas emissions of cattle farming are the methane emissions from the manure management. And you could avoid these emissions by building biogas plants and use the manure to produce electricity or heat or whatever. And is it possible to finance biogas plants within this program?
And the third question? Ready?
I'm Jafeth Muli from Kenya, Trocare. Just again to Gabriela on the livestock management. You've said that, of course, we know that there's a lot of emissions when it comes to livestock. What is different in your approach that is reducing the emissions? Maybe in one statement to know how you're doing it.
Okay.
Thank you. I will see if I got all the questions. We are focusing more now on middle-size and large-size cattle farmers in Latin America. That's the current focus, and it also has a objective of what we are discussing before of leveraging and having scale. This has been really something that we have been working on all the funds that we advise. And this is also the mandate that we have from the investors. So in this sense, this would be our focus. Regarding the second question, yes, we are also financing biodigesters, for example. So we are also concerned about the energy generation part. I don't know if I got your question right. So it's one of the important parts, waste management, how we can improve in the farms because of nitrous oxide. Yeah, so it's an important aspect for us as well. And the third question, pastoral systems. Yeah, okay. Yeah, so as well, this is also part of our understanding. I think this was also one question that Lini had. We don't have, because we are not financing yet, we don't have the impact of this, but we know how much about the gains related to this practice. So I think it also relates a bit to what you said about technical assistance and how we can actually raise awareness of the gains, not only in terms of environmental gains and in terms of emissions, but also how the positive impact it has in the management practice and therefore in their profit as well.
This was a question about smallholder farmers' risk insurance. It's a useful question. And although F3 Life provides a sort of a very defined solution around credit scoring and including climate criteria in farmers' credit scores, we are exploring partnerships with insurance providers whereby information that we supply around farmers' adoption of climate-smart agricultural practices results in a reduction of the premium that they are required to pay for that insurance. And that's quite exciting because one of the barriers to wide-scale uptake of I guess, weather index insurance, parametric insurance products has been the cost. Typically looking at sort of 5-7% of loan value. If smallholder farmers are doing the equivalent of wearing a seatbelt and reducing their risk, then there should be a compensation by way of reduction of premium to them.
Ash, did you want to come?
Okay, thank you for your question. Certainly, we don't aim to support large businesses. First of all, they don't need the finance. It's not an appropriate use of public funding in any case. But there are cases, for example, where we will provide technical support to companies which are involved in processing, for example, in the beef sector. But the majority of our programs tend to work with SMEs, for example, in the rice sector. In Thailand, and also small and medium-sized coffee processors and grinders in Costa Rica.
We have time for one more round of questions. 3 questions.
So, hello. My name is Alejandra. I'm from Colombia. In Colombia, most of the farmers are small. And I would like to know how can we make sure that finance is reaching smallholders farmers and not just the larger farmers?
Thank you very much. Sorry, I'm late. So, I'm Dlani Ponkondwana from Gauteng province in South Africa. I just need you to, if you have considered this, now we are talking about a futuristic farm or the farm of the future. And I'm not sure whether some of the instruments that you have do fund that, because as we put our money, we must consider the future and make sure that whatever the farmers are doing, it's something that will make sure that will reduce the adverse effect of climate change. But anyone can respond to that. I just need to get a sense. Thank you.
Great questions, both. A third question? All right. Yes, please.
Thank you. I'm from Vietnam because I see so far most questions come from Africa. And I just want to ask Mark and other speakers I will follow in the later stage of this workshop that I'm very interested in your model. And I'm just wondering what is the criteria for farmers that you select to join your activities, and also do you intend to help them to link your activities with the farmers to the carbon market to get some income, and how do you work with the banks, because in your presentations you not mention so much about how you work with the bank. Thank you. And also the last one is that for the MRV in your 5 steps, how can you link for the MRV procedures or credit procedures into the MRV at the national level? Thank you.
Okay, thanks. So we only have a couple of minutes to address this. If you want to take any of the panelists who'd like to address any of these questions, please go ahead. Anybody? Mark?
Should I deal with that direct question first? What criteria do we use to assess which farmers can join? Well, actually, that's not up to us. We only provide the designs for the Climate-smart credit product and the tools for monitoring the farmers are in compliance with the requirements of their loan. So it's very much left to the third-party lenders that we work with who they select. That question crosses the other question about how do you make sure that smallholder farmers also benefit from this. Well, there's an issue here because at the moment, only only sort of 15 to 20% of smallholder farmers are considered to be conventionally bankable, and that means that sort of a very large percentage, 75 to 80%, are not going to be able to access, that will benefit from accessing working capital facilities, for example, and that's undoubtedly a real concern. We've tried to address that with a different product line, and if you'd like to have a look at it online, you can go to the website greenfi.org. And see the sort of the product that we've developed for that, but that relies on capital grants and isn't a sort of financially scalable solution in the way that F3 Life offers. We haven't thought about linking to carbon markets. We don't see a bankable sort of business there, or sort of a business case for integration with carbon markets at this point. We definitely look at it if that changed. And linking to national level MRVs, that's something that I think we could benefit from some advice as to how to do. And the final question was about adaptation. Our system very much is geared towards transitioning farmers, or providing the incentives to farmers to adopt more climate-smart agricultural practices, which will assist in their adaptation, and means that they can continue to benefit from accessing working capital facilities. There are some mitigation or sequestration benefits associated with that, but we've typically sort of seen this as a sort of an adaptation-based business with mitigation benefits rather than the other way around.
So I'm afraid we do have to move on, but we now are addressing the farm of the future because this next section is about the future, the vision for the next step. So it's my pleasure to introduce Lizzie Teague, who's the first of our two discussants. She'll speak for 3 minutes and tell us what needs to happen.
Thank you, Lenny. Good afternoon. My name is Lizzie Teague, and I work with Root Capital. Root Capital is a lender that provides loans and business training to small and medium-sized agricultural enterprises in Asia, Africa, and Latin America. Root Capital borrowers range from coffee cooperatives in Guatemala or Peru to macadamia nut traders and processors in Kenya to sorghum traders in Ghana. The common element we look for is that these businesses source from smallholder farmers and are having some sort of positive impact on their community and on the environment. Just to give you a sense of numbers, our average borrower is working with around 1,000 farmers, and these farmers are generally managing between 2 and 5 hectares of land. Our average borrower has around $1 million in revenue, and our average loan to these businesses is around $650,000. Since we started in 1999, Root Capital has lent over $1 billion to 660 businesses around the world, representing 1 million smallholder farmers. So Lenny asked us to speak to the path forward in 3 minutes to what is needed to scale mitigation, finance, and agriculture. I wanted to echo a thread mentioned by all the speakers today, that mitigation finance in the agricultural sector often requires a blended finance approach, mixing commercial capital with targeted public funding or subsidy to cover higher cost and risk for investors and technical assistance for investees. This has certainly been our experience with mitigation loans to agricultural enterprises, at least if we want to reach smallholders and at least if we want to operate at scale. So Root Capital's mitigation lending to date has focused on capital expenditure loans for coffee farm replanting, which currently make up about 10% of our $90 million portfolio, or for clean technology investments, often at the business level. In both cases, Root Capital needed loan guarantees to cover the higher risk and grants to cover technical assistance for our borrowers. We couldn't and wouldn't price the cost of risk or technical assistance into our loans. Our borrowers and their farmers simply wouldn't have been able to afford the resulting interest rates. So recently, we've started to see more talk about the need for blended finance for climate action, which we think is encouraging. But we all seem a bit stuck in the talking stage, with relatively few mitigation investments actually going out the door. At least in the smallholder sector, one challenge has been finding the right flavors of blended capital to resource these mitigation loans. Not surprisingly, it's hard to find concessionary capital. It's hard to find subsidy. And frankly, we don't blame funders for being wary, because financial institutions often don't give funders good visibility into the financial and impact returns of different mitigation investments. As an outside donor or investor, it can be really hard to distinguish good below-market investing with mitigation co-benefits from simply bad financial investing. So one idea to scale mitigation finance in agriculture is for financial institutions to open their books and share data on expected and, most importantly, when available, realized mitigation and financial returns. Then investors and donors can shop around and see what mitigation really costs in different sectors and geographies using different financial products at different scales. And they can decide where they want to place their capital and how they think it should be blended. My hope is that transparency will help attract more capital to mitigation in agriculture, because it will build trust among financial institutions, donors, and investors, while hopefully sparking some healthy competition in finding the most efficient ways to address this problem in different scenarios. Root Capital recently shared the tools that we're developing to manage the financial and impact returns of our general agricultural lending. But this is only one fund's first crack at the challenge, and it's not specific to mitigation impacts. So we think a much broader effort is needed to really get a sense of what capital is needed to achieve our mitigation goals and to together build scalable models to address this challenge. And after seeing the speakers present today, I think we're off to a good start. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Lizzie. Great. And Juan Chang from the Green Climate Fund. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for this opportunity. Just very briefly. I have a few minutes only. My name is Juan Chang. I work for the Green Climate Fund. So probably some of you already know how the GCF operates, but basically GCF has some criteria in order to approve projects, and there are 6 criteria that we use for approving projects, which are impact potential, paradigm shift potential, sustainable development potential, needs of the recipient, efficiency and effectiveness, and country ownership. So what I was hearing during these presentations is that all these initiatives cover all these criteria, and this is very encouraging to see, because at the moment, GCF has approved around more than $900 million in land use sector projects. And in most cases, these proposals that we have been receiving rely largely on public sector investments. And in most cases, the preferred instrument is grant instrument. But then we always struggle in the discussion saying, how do you assure sustainability of these investments in the land use sector if you are only relying on grants? So what we have here in this presentation is there is innovation and there is an opportunity. And what I heard, and I took note of very interesting points, use public sector for catalyzing private sector or de-risking private sector. That's very interesting and very encouraging to hear, and that there are already initiatives going on that direction. Also, very interesting is that looking into mitigation as an opportunity, creating new instruments, financial instruments, to address a problem, but at the same time find an opportunity. How it was mentioned many times also today, how in the process of addressing adaptation, you can also find a benefit for the farmers and increasing the livelihoods. So overall, there is an interesting landscape going ahead. The initiatives are going. As a GCF, we really look forward to and encourage having investments that look into these criteria has been described, triggering private sector, using public sector to catalyze private investments. Something that the GCF is also looking at the moment is the traceability of deforestation-free commodities, which was also very interesting to hear. It's already ongoing, and there are already initiatives in many parts in the world. But in order to get to this criteria that we call paradigm shift, there needs to be a more articulated and probably a more strategic way to put together the instruments, the policies, and the financial that can come in order to get to these outcomes. I think that's all I have for the moment. Thank you very much.
All right. So now we have, about 20 minutes for discussion with all of you. And I'm going to turn over to Fraser. Both Fraser and I will facilitate this. And this is an opportunity for you to put forward your vision and ask questions, and for the panelists to also engage in the discussion.
I'd love to know who's in the room. How many people are... I know you're in the room. Thank you. I don't mean like that. No, maybe you have a question. We'll come back to you. I'm not going to read this. No, who's with government? Who works with government? And private sector, civil society. Any groups that I missed that somebody would like to shout out? Research. I was only joking. Okay, that's quite a mix across the board. How many people would know what blended finance is? That's not so many, only about less than half. The word leverage in terms of finance. So that's got places leveraging public money to mobilize more private finance. Okay, so we see where we are. Now, where do you want to go from here, Lenny? We have one question, I think, to kick things off. Shoot, not too hard now.
Bonjour, je vais poser ma question en français. J'ai bien écouté en fait vos différentes interventions et donc j'aimerais poser une question effectivement sur la spécificité de l'agriculture en Afrique de l'Ouest. Vous savez très bien, j'ai bien suivi les finances dans le secteur de l'agriculture. Alors, en Afrique de l'Ouest, donc, on a aussi l'agriculture familiale. Et
I'm going to just ask, is there somebody that can, in a very ad hoc way, translate? Yeah. We have a volunteer here. Do you need to translate now, or can he finish? Yeah, go ahead and finish, yeah. Thank you.
Voilà, donc en Afrique de l'Ouest, effectivement, il y a l'agriculture familiale. Et donc les financements dans le secteur agricole ici, s'agit-il effectivement des financements de l'agro-industrie ou de l'agriculture familiale? Et comment est-ce que les petits agriculteurs en fait, voilà, pourraient donc bénéficier de ces financements? Est-ce qu'il y a déjà des mécanismes et quelles sont les structures auxquelles ils pourraient éventuellement s'adresser? Voilà, c'est ma question. Merci.
Thank you very much. We have our translator here. Thank you for stepping up.
Yeah, no problem. So the question comes from someone from West Africa, saying that, asking the question whether all these mechanisms are geared toward agro industries, big, large-scale industries, or rather smallholders in West Africa. We talked about familial. Small families of farmers, and are these financial mechanisms geared towards such structures?
Let's keep it out there at the moment. Are there any other questions that just want to jump in? Go ahead, please. And then here next. So next here. Oh.
So I think now I have opportunities to address to NAMA facility and also to GSEF. During the presentations, I see that you mentioned a lot about the private sector. And GSEF just announced the private sector window for countries to submit their proposals. So can you, GSEF, update us on how many proposals for the private window that you received, and how many % of the proposals focus on agriculture and adaptation? And to both NAMA facility and GSEF, that how many private sectors or companies, international groups that you have been successfully involving them to give fund to NAMA facilities and to GSEF. Thank you.
And one more. There was a couple of other hands raised. I think this lady.
Thank you. Gabriela Burian here, representing the World Business Council for Sustainable Development, Climate-Smart Agriculture. My question is for Gabriela, for Ash, and for Mark. Our great presentation, how can we help you to leverage this process? What do you need to scale up those great initiatives? Thank you.
And we'll take one more here while we're on.
Yeah, it's Clyde Graham from Fertilizer Canada, the Association for Fertilizer Companies in Canada. I'm just wondering, you were asking questions of who represents what. I'm just wondering, of the people involved in finance, who's interested in working in terms of with the fertilizer industry in terms of improving mitigation and outcomes?
That's a good question. So one more while we're on the roll. I know the panel is itching to jump on these.
Okay, Victor Comoral from CIMIT in Mexico. More a comment. What struck me a little bit, and I'm a bit worried about that, is these are pieces of a puzzle that need to fit together a bit more. For example, the credit services for smallholder farmers that you described, Mark, combination with index insurance, and that again with things that really are attractive to farmers, just as an example of being a bit more comprehensive. Same with what you're doing in Latin America. I'm wondering, it should be about more of a cycle. Agroforestry should play a role. I mean, it's not just the livestock value chain, right? It needs to be, if you want to incentivize farmer behavior change, what are you doing there really, apart from just providing finance that may not be provided by a Nicaraguan bank because it's not there? Yeah?
Okay. So this is good. I mean, we're getting to some meat on the bones, and that's really what we want. I want to zero in on Angela's statistic. 0.5% of public finance is going to mitigation in agriculture. I mean, as you said, there are pieces of the jigsaw here. One speaker talked about the need to put all our data out there so that investors can analyze it and see where to address. There was another comment about this sort of disaggregated and idiosyncratic approach to deals and how we need to increasingly, get our ducks in a row and clarify how we're going to do this. So if the panel, in responding to these questions, could just jump on this question of what are the answers? How do we find a way forward here at COP23 on some of these huge challenges that we face in the context of the questions asked? So who wants to kick off? I think Alex Mulisa has been very quiet there for a while.
I just would speak from my experience with the fund. When we started talking about getting into the smallholder farmer space, it seemed like a no-go zone. But I really think that it's a question, like most other things, of what ideas are needed for the smallholder farmers to go commercial. I think for the most part, Rwanda has been convinced that it is not public grants that are going to make a difference, both in climate change and in development. So the question is, how do we come up with the right kind of tools and instruments and mechanisms that can bring on board the credit worthiness of smallholder farmers, considering that 80% of the people in agriculture, which contributes right now to 33% of the economy, how do we bring them on board? And once we took that road, we have seen, the likes of Unilever coming in the fold to be able to provide schemes. Wood Foundation is a British social enterprise that is operating in that space. And what is really needed is the mechanisms and the tools, and which is why the Climatesmart Lending platform, what Mark has been talking about, the F3 Life model, is very attractive to us. And we are in the process of seeing how the public sector resources can actually de-risk investments and bring on board smallholder farmers through cooperatives to be able to manage grant schemes. What is also interesting is that we have seen some banks that are now local banks that never even thought that would be possible coming on board. We have what we call Urwego Opportunity Bank that is beginning to work with the cooperatives to provide loan schemes for these kind of farmers. A question came through in terms of how do we even address the farmer of the future. For us, tea and coffee are cash crops that generate revenue for the country. And there are so many farmers who have been doing it in the wetland, so to speak. And right now, part of the studies have indicated that a transition to, hill slopes is not only going to bring about soil stabilization, but it is actually the way to go in terms of dealing with the future climate impacts. So these are co-benefits that can come from a carefully and deliberate approach to working with the smallholder farmers and trying to increase knowledge and diversify mechanisms, financial mechanisms that can allow them to begin, investing themselves beyond just what the grants of the likes of Green Climate Fund can do. Matter of fact, one of the projects we have in the Green Climate Fund that we are working with is dealing with this kind of thing. We have a loan scheme that will provide a rolling mechanism for the smallholder farmers. It's on a pilot level, and we believe that we are going to be impacting the future through climate-smart lending platforms for smallholder farmers.
Thank you very much, Alex. We have 10 minutes left, so keep going. And anybody, you are allowed to jump in here with a yes, but. Just do that if you like.
So just to quickly, as we had the question here, I was mentioning first, we are already investing in crops, and now we are preparing our approach to livestock production. But what you said, we are totally, convinced that agroforestry and these systems are important. So, for example, in El Salvador, we have been working with shaded grown coffee under agroforestry systems. So we have been, this is why we are also not only working with sustainability certifications, but developing this green list approach to see what practice we would like to enhance. And also mentioning about the small farmers, I also wanted to mention that most of our technical assistance we have been providing to the financial institutions on how they can tailor their approach. So although we are not investing directly in the cattle farming in smallholders, we would like to see, as we were saying, the commodities, deforestation-free supply chains, that they also start using these tools that we are using, that we are planning to use, like the satellite images that they incorporate in their normal loan process, so that it also influences the smallholders. And finally, regarding cooperation, I think this is a very good point, because basically cooperation is essential, I would say. So we are already, for example, in touch with Nestlé in Panama, because they are working with milk production there and supporting them to transition to the market and adapt. And we are very willing to work with the industry sector to cooperate and merge. I didn't touch anything. And to merge efforts so that it can also be mainstreamed.
Lizzie, how would you achieve this, opening up all of the private financiers' data?
Well, I think first of all, one challenge and one reason why I'm also wary to speak for the entire financial sector is that when we talk about finance, even when we're talking about impact investing in agriculture, you're looking at very different types of financial institutions that are doing very different types of things. So we are a debt lender. We provide short-term loans. We're able to look at each loan and look at the financial returns in a way that's fairly straightforward. We're looking at interest revenue and fee revenue, and then we're able to compare that with the cost of making that loan, and then we're able to look at the expected impact using tools that we've developed ourselves. And so we went through the exercise of really just putting up on the board the cost of these loans relative to the impact. I mean, it's very common in the financial sector that you look at the profit of an investment relative to the cost, relative to the risk. And so we basically tried to just introduce a third dimension to that, which is the impact, and graph that and see what came out. And we were able to do that with the 2,000 loans that we've made over the last 15 years. And so that's the approach that we took, and that could be, we've published several resources related to that, and that's been very enlightening for us and for our investors. But I think, we want to prompt the conversation, but each organization, each institution will need to find its own way. And I actually think in the impact investing space, there's a very robust conversation around this. There's a lot of, there's just a big effort to say, we've been working in this space for 10, 15 years. How can we get better at showing the actual impact of what we do and comparing that to the cost? And so if you look at the GIN, which is the Global Impact Investor Network, or other similar resources, there's a very large conversation happening, and I would really encourage folks in the climate space to look at that, to try to enter that space. I know many of us would be very interested in climate funders and climate action practitioners entering that space and learning together.
And Juan, there was a question again about information and data out of GCF, and what's your perspective on this question?
Yes, first of all, clarify that it's not a new window of private sector. It's the private sector facility is been constituted since the beginning, and we have been approving projects since 2015. In most of the portfolio of the private sector is on energy generation, mostly. In private sector, we haven't, in land use agriculture, we haven't seen much private sector investments at the moment. And that's what I find very interesting in this panel, that there are already very interesting and innovative opportunities for private sector engagement in the land use sector. What private sector has done recently is to launch a request for proposals for leveraging private sector capital. And we received around 300 proposals that still are under review. So there was an initiative from this private sector facility that already exists. I just wanted to highlight one aspect that Angela mentioned in her interesting spaghetti slide, is that in many cases, that's actually one of the key issues that we see in our, when we receive proposals. In some cases, it's not necessarily a lack of finance. Sometimes it's the existing finance that is already ongoing in the sector that may need to drive a little bit, and that's where we see the additional need for finance that the climate finance can provide. The public funds that these climate institutions have, like the GCF, is going to be very limited for what is needed in order to address climate change. And we see there is a great opportunity to link already existing finance available, innovative mechanisms, and to find what is the maximum value that we can get with the limited public sources that we have in climate finance.
So we're in the closing minutes, and I know there are questions. Of course, you can stay afterwards, but I would like the remaining panelists, Anna and Mark, to just a minute or a minute and a half each. Maybe start with Angela, and then yeah.
I'll actually pass because I'll do a quick summary at the end. So.
I'm not sure that's in the rules, but okay, I'll let you. Go ahead. Yeah. No.
Okay, thank you. I think we've discussed private sector engagement, and there's been a lot of discussion around how, at least in the climate finance space, how to bring more domestic actors into the game. And I think there was a question around how much international companies are involved. Most of our programs have a focus on domestic companies, but that's just how it works. We have no problems working with international companies. But I think the issue really, I think, is around financing and bringing commercial financial institutions in country on board, because we find that many of these programs, larger programs, don't move forward because they're reliant on multilateral development banks or larger regional development banks. And I think that's something that we've tried to work with, is trying to get these people into the lending business, because they're too busy lending to telecoms and hotels and things which are much easier and nicer for them to do. And one practical way we found, for example, is to buy down some of those costs. So, for example, we have a program in Mexico. It's not actually an agribusiness project, but there we found that we've been able to entice the private sector financing organizations, so commercial banks in country, to lend by subsidizing their guarantee fees. So you're buying down some of the cost of them participating in a financing scheme. That's just one practical way of taking it forward. Also, the idea of working with banks to overcome their barriers through technical assistance is also a very, very useful and very high value activity for public funding, because you can get a lot of value from getting these people on board.
I'd take that interesting question about the holistic approach to getting the incentives right for smallholder farmers, and I think the observation with which we started our business was that 99% of environmental degradation, including climate change, is driven by economic activity. Most economic activity is underpinned by systems of credit. And if we don't get into the rules around credit and how credit is supplied, then all of the other agri-environmental programs that we engage in are only going to be sticking plasters, because the way in which the credit structures are established mean that a perverse incentive is created for the overuse of natural capital. So, on that observation, I can go to the question around, what needs to happen. Well, I think, what we'd like to see ultimately happening is the sort of the fundamental sort of rules around credit issue changed at a national, maybe even international levels. We see a movement towards that happening. The Financial Stability Board recommendations for disclosure of climate risk and mitigation by financial institution boards is a step in the right direction. But we'd really like to see greater sort of study and emphasis on that point. And in the meantime, and in this very sort of specific sector of smallholder finance provision, we've created a sort of a solution which provides defined environmental and financial returns. But we've stumbled into a greater problem, which is that in the face of climate risk, a number of the businesses that have been lending hundreds of millions of dollars to smallholder farmers have found themselves on suddenly sort of without a business case for continuing, and without first loss guarantees and potentially also capital or capex subsidies. Those businesses on whom smallholders depend for their working capital facilities are going to fail. And that's a massive, massive, massive adaptation problem.
Well, thank you very much, everybody. I'm going to ask Angela to take the podium or to stay here for your final conclusions.
Okay, great. So thank you. And I've just been sort of listening to all of the comments here and trying to pull out the key themes to play it back to you. And hopefully I've sort of captured everything. But the others may want to come in, and Lini might want to add. So the question we sort of posed at the start of this session was, how do we get from the single figures of climate finance that's flowing to agriculture to hundreds of billions as in line with the opportunity that's out there and the needs to mitigate in this sector, but also adapt and realise those co-benefits for sustainable development. I think probably the main phrase that's come up is farms of the future. How do we look for future financial sustainability of all types of farmer and sizes of farm, from smallholders right through to large holders and all of the players that are involved in the supply chain? How do we realise growth in the sector whilst integrating all of the multiple benefits on mitigation, adaptation, and economic growth? I think what was sort of where our discussion was going towards is where are the permanent financing solutions to redirect existing financial flows? And there we see the different roles of different providers of finance, so the role of public funds and governments. I heard the high potential leverage of technical assistance, which is an important point. The role of domestic public budgets and policies, smart subsidies, taxes, to create and identify opportunities for the private sector, and then the role of national and local banks as well. So I think what we've heard with this excellent panel here of organisations that are really working in this space, the financial institutions and funds that are showing great examples of progress to de-risk investments for the private sector, to build that project pipeline, to look for innovative policies that can bring private sector to the table. And as Ash said, the test bed for innovative financing instruments, technologies and tools that can make all of this happen. So I think we've seen some great examples today. Question is then, what is the next step to really take that to scale? And I think you're all part of the solution as well. So thank you. Maybe Lini wants to add.
Just to say thank you, everybody. With the permission of the speakers, we'll post these presentations on the CCAFs and probably other websites as well. And we have your emails. If you haven't signed the list, please do. And we'll have an opportunity to share more information that way. So thank you. And thank you to all the speakers, especially.